So looking at an overview of the respiratory system, we first want to look at the three major parts of ventilation. The first is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is what you think of as breathing because it is involving the exchange of gases or air between the atmosphere outside of you and the inside of your lungs. So inhalation and exhalation. External respiration is not external with the atmosphere, but between the pulmonary capillaries and your alveoli, so the inside air sacs of your lungs, so between the alveoli and pulmonary capillaries. And then the reason that we breathe is for internal respiration. This is where we exchange oxygen and CO2 through systemic capillaries in your body when it's transported the oxygen and your tissue cells. So pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, and internal respiration should be fully understood second nature before moving on too much further, because these are the essence of what we are going to study. So the lungs are paired organs. Your right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2 lobes, and a cardiac notch. They look like an upside down tree as they are branching. So from our lower respiratory tract, from the larynx down into the trachea branch off into 2 main bronchi that go into the right and left lungs. Each main bronchi has further branching systems called lobar bronchi that go into different lobes of the lung. They branch into segmental, or those are also called tertiary bronchi, then bronchioles about 1 millimeter wide, and then smaller terminal bronchioles that open up onto alveolar sacs, where we have pulmonary capillaries surrounding them. So here we see the orders of branching from the trachea to alveolar sacs, and the names and number we have. But when we get down to the terminal bronchioles, we have those alveolar ducts with alveolar sacs surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. Notice that the conducting zone is an area to warm and moisten air, and that goes from the trachea all the way down to the terminal bronchioles. The respiratory zone is where we actually start having gas exchange all the way from the respiratory bronchioles to the alveoli. So when we look at the alveolar sacs, notice that they come off of a terminal bronchiole. They look like little grape-like clusters, and this is a great example in anatomy of how structure relates to function, because we want the alveoli to be very thin-walled so that oxygen and CO2 can cross them very easily. So they are made of one single layer of simple squamous epithelium, good for diffusion. We can see that in the microscope figure there. And they're surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. And notice that they're walled off in little lobules of the lung. So they are sac-like structures for exchange of gases. There are actually 2 types of cells, type 1 and type 2, and the one that we have the most numerous is, like I said, simple squamous cells, and they're considered type 1 epithelial cells. They are fused to capillary endothelial cells and are thin for gas exchange, but in a lesser amount we have type 2 alveolar cells, which are simply cuboidal cells covered in microvilli, and even though there are less of them, they're very important because they secrete a chemical called surfactant. And surfactant is kind of like a mixture of fatty substances and phospholipids, and what it does is mixes with fluid on the inside of those alveoli to break up surface tension of water. So if you think about blowing a bubble, it floats through the air, but quickly it pops. The reason for that is because due to the polar covalent bonds in water molecules, the water molecules in that bubble are more closely attracted to one another than they are the air molecules on the outside and the inside of the bubble. So constantly, while the bubble is floating through the air, it's pulling inward on all sides because all those water molecules are attracted to one another, and that's why it pops quickly. If you just had a layer of water on the inside of those alveoli, just moisture, then your alveoli would collapse and not stay inflated. They're very thin, kind of like a bubble, because those water molecules have surface tension that make them more attracted to one another than the air around them. So we have surfactant to lower that surface tension so they don't collapse. Now there is a bit of surface tension because when we exhale, we want the alveoli to assume a smaller position. So there still is some, but that surfactant produced by type 2 alveolar cells cuts down on it greatly so we don't have collapsed alveoli. Respiratory distress syndrome sometimes occurs in premature infants because they don't actually develop these type 2 alveolar cells and surfactant until later in fetal development. So this is why many times premature infants experience respiratory distress syndrome. That's what causes those alveoli collapse. And finally, not a type, but you also have alveolar macrophages, just white blood cells that eat up debris in the bottom of those alveoli. The respiratory membrane sounds complex, but all this is are all the layers that oxygen and CO2 must go across in external respiration between the alveoli and pulmonary capillaries. It consists of the simple squamous epithelium and basement membrane of both the capillary and the alveoli. So notice it's a very thin membrane that gases have to cross. Something else very interesting that happens is ventilation perfusion coupling, and this may not sound special, but notice that what happens here at the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs is the opposite to what happens everywhere else in the body. So blood enters the lungs through the pulmonary arteries and exits through the pulmonary veins. And we have oxygen and CO2 exchange at the capillaries. So oxygen goes from your alveoli into pulmonary capillaries. CO2 goes from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. You've got those little pulmonary capillaries surrounding all areas, showing you a picture here. So surrounding all these areas of alveolar sacs, and there are many of these. We have a large surface area. But in response to hypoxia, so if there are areas of the alveoli that are not filled with lots of oxygen, that's hypoxia, low oxygen, those pulmonary capillaries respond by vasoconstricting. And what happens is they shunt blood to areas of pulmonary capillaries around alveoli that do have high amounts of oxygen. So they can shunt blood to high ventilated areas with lots of oxygen from poorly ventilated areas. And note this is different than anywhere else in the body, because in other areas of the body, what happens is vessels will respond by vasodilating many times when there's lower amounts because they're trying to extract the oxygen possible. But ventilation perfusion couplings means they can constrict in low oxygen areas, so we have more blood to go to highly oxygenated areas.